What's up, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Bulwark. In this video, I want to talk about a lost tradition of the church, namely the Ember Days. Now, some of you may have heard of the Ember Days before, and for others, this might be a completely new concept. For those of you who don't know, the Ember Days were a series of Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays that the church kept as days of fasting and abstinence in thanksgiving to Almighty God for the goods of the earth. This in turn taught people to use the goods of the earth in moderation, and then, of course, to be generous to those less fortunate than themselves. Now, the Ember Days occurred 4 times a year. In Latin, they are simply called Quatuor Tempora, which simply means 4 times. Now, in this context, the word ember doesn't have anything to do with fire. It's actually just a corruption of the word tempora. So somehow tempora came into English as ember, and it's as simple as that. Now, the 4 times a year that the Ember Days are talking about are the changing of the seasons. This is fitting because, again, people here are giving thanks to God for the goods of the earth. So there are the September Ember Days for the fall, the Advent Ember Days for the winter, the Lent Ember Days for the spring, and the Pentecost Ember Days for the summer. Now, to get a deeper understanding of the Ember Days, we have to look at their history. And the history of the Ember Days is rather interesting because they're kind of shrouded in mystery. They're so old that it's difficult to pinpoint exactly how and when they started. But based on the information that we have, we're able to put it together pretty well. On the one hand, there is an Old Testament biblical foundation in which the Jews were called to keep a fast at the changing of each of the seasons. And this appears to be an example of an Old Testament practice that carried on into the early church. Now, St. Leo the Great mentions that this actually had apostolic foundations. Now, as an interesting side note, in the Eastern churches, they don't have the Ember Days. It was only in the West, and it started in Rome. So it appears that the practice of the Ember Days began with St. Peter. Also, there was the influence of the culture at large. The pagans at the time also had some kind of a commemoration of the changing of seasons. Now, the early church was generally allergic to all things pagan, but the idea of giving thanks for the goods of the earth, well, that's something that the Christian faithful can get into. And so there did develop this liturgical celebration of giving thanks to God for the goods of the earth at the changing of the seasons. Now, as I mentioned, this was well established by the time of St. Leo the Great, who was Pope in the 5th century. We then see it carrying on certainly in Rome through the centuries, and then St. Gregory VII in the 11th century extended the celebration of the Ember Days to all of the churches in the West. Now, an important concept here is that when the Ember Days were kept, they were not kept as a feast. So the Christian faithful were not going out and gorging themselves on the Ember Days. Rather, they were fasting, which seems a little countercultural for us. We might think, well, if you're celebrating the goods of God's earth, well, then you should consume them. But here, they were consuming them only in moderation. Now, moving into the 20th century, that is where we start to see things loosen up in regards to the Ember Days. Originally, all 3 of them were kept as days of fasting and total abstinence from meat. So think of something akin to maybe how we keep Ash Wednesday now. Well, this got changed in the 20th century to where the Wednesday and the Saturday of the Ember Days were moved to partial abstinence. So people could eat meat during their main meal, but at no other times of the day. And then Friday was kept as a day of total abstinence, and all 3 were kept as days of fasting. Then in the 1960s is when the practice was really abolished altogether. Now, there are some vague mentions in 1970 about how the individual bishops' conferences of each country are to establish the Ember Days as they are to be carried out in their own countries, but certainly in the United States, that never happened. Now, personally, I think that this is a great loss to the church because we live in such an overindulgent culture that to take a step back and deny ourselves is a very good thing, physically, mentally, and most importantly, spiritually. And because they take place at the beginning of the seasons, it's a good time for us to remember from whom these good things came and to give thanks to Him. Now, one thing that I didn't mention here is the tradition of the ordination of priests on Ember Saturday. So way back in the day, most priests, actually all priests, were ordained on Ember Saturday. That is just how it was. And so the Ember Days became time where people would pray and fast for vocations to the priesthood and also for priests themselves. And so again, that's just a very good thing for us to pray and fast for. So what should we do about this today? As I mentioned, I think that this was a great loss for the church. And if you attend the traditional Latin Mass, there are liturgical texts that are still existent for these Ember Days. So if you show up to a traditional Latin Mass on Ember Wednesday, you are going to be celebrating Ember Wednesday at Mass. So what are we to do about this? How can we get this restored? Well, it really starts with you and me. If I want the Ember Days to be restored, then I need to keep them myself. Although it is no longer morally obligatory for Catholics to keep them, we can still choose to keep them on our own volition. And so I enjoin everybody in this video to keep the Ember Days. But you might be wondering, when exactly are the Ember Days? I mean, I mentioned the head of the seasons, but which particular days? Well, there's actually a little rhyme that the church traditionally used to remember them. And basically, it was Lenti, Penti, Cruci, Luci. So Lenti, meaning the Ember Days of Lent, and by the way, Ember Wednesday takes place exactly 1 week after Ash Wednesday. Penti, standing for Pentecost, so the Wednesday after Pentecost is Ember Wednesday. Cruci, standing for the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross on September 14th. And so the third Wednesday of September is Ember Wednesday. And then Lucy, meaning Saint Lucy, whose feast day is December 13th. The Ember Wednesday of December is the Wednesday after December 13th. So you can just remember Lenti, Penti, Cruci, Luci. I invite those who are watching this video to join me and traditionalist Catholics around the world in keeping the Ember Days, in prayer and fasting, in thanksgiving to Almighty God for the goods of the earth, in penance, and of course for vocations to the priesthood. I'm Father Luger, and this has been The Bulwark.